at all politically. I really don't. Anyway, we're going to switch gears. We're going to talk a little bit about North Dakota politics, or not North Dakota politics, North Dakota finances. We have on the line with us our tax commissioner, Ryan Rauschenberger. Ryan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on, Rob.
Thanks for being on. How you doing these days, man? You won re-election. You feeling pretty good about that?
Yeah, I am feeling good. We're busy working now after the election's over. We're working with legislators and interested parties on the upcoming session. I think there'll be just as many tax bills as we've seen in past sessions, if not even more. So there's a lot of ideas out there, and we're every day we're working on new proposals.
You had a pretty unusual election cycle. You had to leave the campaign trail for a while to deal with some personal issues, but you came back, and the voters clearly it gave you a stamp of approval. You got, you won by a large margin. You got a pretty large percentage of the vote. How are you feeling about that? I mean, I guess I look at it. I feel like it's I kind of like the idea. I think a lot of times I think we forget that you folks, even though you're politicians and everybody has a lot of stereotypes about politicians, we sometimes forget that you're human beings too. And I guess I like the idea that North Dakota voters have some room there to not just automatically jump to a conclusion. But I mean, how are you feeling now after coming through that election cycle?
Well, I feel really good about it. When I took a leave of absence for a month to seek treatment, and I've been very open about the fact I think it was one of the better decisions to make. And when I came back, I was very clear that I wouldn't have changed my mind, regardless of it being during the campaign season. That was a personal decision. Feel great, and I've had extreme support and great support across the state. Whenever I run into somebody, what's amazing is, families, whether it's somebody themselves or they've had a spouse, their children or their parents, or aunts, uncles, family, friends that have went through, alcohol treatment, and people understand. I mean, people really understood and supported me for it, and I've been very appreciative of that because, when I made the decision, I wasn't sure. But I'm glad I did. It's one of the best decisions I ever made to kind of remove myself, because I thought that was a key part to having success with the treatment. And that I'm glad, and of course glad that the election, the voters clearly agreed that it's about fair and tax administration and the experience that I have in the office. And I'm very glad to be elected back into the office.
Yeah, well, glad to hear it. Certainly, 701-293-9000, 888-970-9329 if you want to join the program. Let's get on and talk about some of the tax policy. I think a lot of North Dakotans, a lot of people I talk to, feeling a little nervous about oil prices. I think, obviously, oil tax revenues are a significant chunk of our budget, not just the direct tax revenues, but I think also the impact all that activity has on things like the sales tax, the income tax, those sorts of things. Obviously, development and the property tax. How worried, and I know, right now, obviously, the legislative session is looming in January. How worried are people about oil prices? How worried should we be?
Well, it is something we have to be cautious about. We had over $100 a barrel earlier this year. Originally in the forecast, when we started looking at it this last summer, for the 15-17 biennium, we thought, well, we looked at $90 a barrel, and we've really backed that off to anywhere from 72 to 82 for the next biennium. So to put that into perspective, every dollar is about $100 million of just oil taxes off the table based on production, holding that constant, just so there are not so many moving parts. So you take $10 off a price of a barrel of oil, that's $1 billion. And again, like you mentioned, that does not account for impacts on sales tax and income tax. That's just a static analysis of oil tax. But of course, a lot of that, and it's important for your listeners to understand that a lot of that, or usually about half of that actually, is tied up constitutionally. So that's not necessarily general fund dollars. Only $300 million of oil taxes can go into the general fund, and that's capped. But it does have a domino effect on your sales tax and income tax, and we've been looking at the forecast in those areas too, and been cautiously optimistic about them. We're still showing growth, but with some potential pullback, we have looked at sales and income tax and made sure that we're not being overly optimistic in those areas. And we work with the Office of Management and Budget and economy.com, Moody's Analytics actually is their name, and for our modeling going forward. But they do, to put that in perspective, they do believe next year that oil prices are going to rebound and stabilize based on worldwide demand increases. So it would be a demand pull of that price back up.
Sure.
Because we do have a kind of a glut of supply right now. They do think demand, especially in China, which is really driving is really the main driver internationally. China will pick back up in other international consumers of oil and pick up that price.
Well, I honestly, I think we'd have a more stable price too if we ended something. And this is a little beyond the scope of your office, but if we ended some, as Senator Hoban has talked about, ending some of these restrictions on exporting some of this oil. I mean, if we expanded the market for American oil, I think that the American oil market would be a little bit more stable. Let me talk about like what does this mean for specific policy? Now, I know one of the things that you campaigned on was property tax relief. Obviously, if we're uncertain about oil prices, and I think that we can forecast all we want. The thing is that oil prices kind of tend to do what they want anyway. Obviously we got to try to make our best guess, but how can this impact like the case for, say, property tax relief or something like that? I mean, is it going to be difficult for the legislature to make policy changes like that about revenue with this uncertainty with oil prices?
Well, I think it does. I think it does have an impact, and I'll quote Senator Holmberg, who is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. He did say it will put a different light on this session when we think about how oil taxes are used, and a portion of property tax relief comes out of a constitutional fund called the Property Tax Relief Stabilization Fund. And the fund's it's capped at $342 million, but that always is a portion of the property tax relief fund. And with oil prices being down, we do have to look at whether or not additional property tax relief will be possible. I think from looking at the budget and looking at the forecast, I think that sustaining the existing two programs of property tax relief is absolutely viable. Whether or not additional property tax relief will be on the table is going to be a consideration. But of course, as we said, with the fear of lower prices, prioritization becomes important. I do think there's some more room for property tax relief. Just to put that in perspective, when it comes to oil taxes, we're expecting about $6.6 billion in total oil taxes in this current biennium when it finishes in June. And even with the even us pulling back on oil prices in the forecast for next biennium, we're expecting about $8.2 billion for next biennium. So even with the lower prices, we're forecasting still some strong growth. So we're not forecasting a pullback. We are keeping in mind the lower prices, but still expecting a growth in that base. And that's based on the industry input, based on that price of production staying stable and growing, I should say.
701-293-9000 if you want to join the program, 888-970-9329 if you want to call in toll free. You can tweet me too at Rob Port. What about income tax? That was something I'm hearing from a lot of lawmakers that they want, additional cuts to the income tax. Some saying, I believe Representative Scott Lauser from Minot has talked about a moratorium on the income tax for 2 years, or excuse me, that was his proposal last biennium, dropping the income tax rate down to zero, leaving in place the tax, but just dropping all the rates down to zero. What about these proposals in the context of the revenue picture? What do you make of those?
Well, there's a whole range of proposals out there, and I'd say that's definitely one end of the spectrum would be, making the rate zero. There's another idea of, some phase out of income tax. There's other proposals of potentially exempting a certain amount of income. There's a lot of different proposals out there, and I think that's where I think we're going to see a lot of different ideas for income tax. Ranging from elimination to, of course, what we've seen in the past is an overall reduction of the existing brackets, the existing rate brackets. I think, again, tying it just like we mentioned, we were talking about with property tax. I think there's a tendency to there's almost a pullback on some of those elimination ideas or phase-out ideas because of some of the lower oil prices. But we're absolutely going to see the bills and the legislature will have that debate. And along with the elimination bills all the way to the rate reduction bills. So we're going to see a wide variety, I think as wide a variety as ever, of income tax relief bills. And that's for both corporate and individual, I believe.
701-293-9000, 888-970-9329. My guest, Ryan Rauschenberger, our newly reelected tax commissioner. Ryan, what about the spending side of things? Obviously, some pretty aggressive spending has been talked about so far, particularly for Western North Dakota. $800 million surge bill is on the table, plus some additional spending on infrastructure needs in the West and the East. What does the revenue picture look like in terms? Because not just tax cuts, but also in terms of spending. This is still a growing state with growing needs. Are any of those spending projects going to have to be curtailed due to the revenue picture?
Well, luckily, what we'll have at the end of this biennium is a fairly new fund that is funded by oil called the Strategic Investment and Infrastructure Fund, which the legislature can use for one-time infrastructure needs, and a lot of those surge dollars are really benefiting from all of the high prices that we've had throughout this biennium, and of course the continued production for these last 8 months of the biennium. So there will be a balance there that could be used for the surge funding. So when it comes to that upfront, those infrastructure dollars that can be passed by the legislature with an emergency clause, so it can get right out there for the next spring and for the bidding season in the West. Those dollars are really there, which is good because there's some surety there because we're using existing dollars, we're not using forecasted dollars for those one-time expenditures. And on the other side of that, you'd mentioned additional Western infrastructure. The proposals and Senator Rich Wardner has proposed increasing the oil gross production tax formula to give 60% of that to the local political subdivision, 40% to the state, which would be a large increase to the political subdivisions. And like you said, there's a lot of infrastructure needs out there, and not just infrastructure, but social services needs to catch up with all of the development in the western part of the state. Certainly. And I think given the, and based on what we've seen, we're still able to do that, even given some of the lower prices.
Sure. Ryan, can you hold through a segment? I got to take a break here, but I think we had a caller on the line that wanted to ask a question. Great. Lee, welcome to the program. You're on with Rob Port and the Tax Commissioner, Ryan Rauschenberger. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you. First of all, good morning, gentlemen, and congratulations, Mr. Rauschenberger.
Oh, thank you very much.
I have a question about the tax relief issue. We hear so much about property tax relief. What about why can't we just use income tax relief? I'm through circumstances beyond my control. I am now no longer a property owner. I'm a renter due to the divorce, and I don't see the property tax relief as a fair and equal across the board relief. Why can't we just do the income tax?
Well, that's it is a good question, and there has been a lot of focus on both income and property tax relief in prior sessions. And like I was mentioning before the break, I think we're seeing more relief proposals on the income tax side this session than probably property taxes, because so much was done with changing school funding and the 12% statewide credit last session that, although, like I was mentioned, there probably still will be some proposals like the one I proposed to increase property tax relief. But also I've been in support of a broad-based income tax relief across the board. And I do think we have room to do more in the area of income tax relief. We're already one of the lowest individual income tax states in the nation, of the 43 states that have income taxes. But we still have room to go lower, as long as the rest of the budget holds up with sales tax and other taxes. I think we have more room. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, like I said, I just think it's more fair. I mean, the property tax relief is great. I'm all for that if that happens. But the thing about it is I believe in my heart that it hurts. The property tax relief is good, but the income tax would be better across the board simply because it helps, for instance, low-income people that don't own property, or people like myself who used to own and now don't because of my circumstance. It just seems to me more fair that everybody would get it if it was an income tax. I realize that higher income people would get more, but still, the lower income people would get some relief where they wouldn't being, having just property tax. I'll hang up and listen, but that's my point.
And it's something. Thanks for the call, Lee. Appreciate it. It's something to keep in mind too. Is that with the income tax, when you cut tax rates, upper income people get more back, but they also pay more. So, and it's also hard. It's our tax code has become so progressive in some ways that people who don't make a lot don't also. I mean, they pay almost nothing. So it's really hard for that argument. But I think he makes a great point. Honestly, I think the legislature's done. I would like to see the legislature get out of the property tax business and focus on something like the income tax. Regardless, I had one last question about the oil tax specifically. I know that's something it's become sort of a third rail issue in North Dakota politics. A lot of people don't even like bringing it up. But with oil prices sort of in flux right now, what is the price point at which the trigger? Explain the oil price trigger for us in terms of the oil tax.
Yeah, Rob, I'll do my best because it's a complicated trigger, but really what has to happen is the NYMEX price, so the posted Western Texas intermediary price of oil has to fall below, and right now it's about $57, has to fall below $57 for about, for 5 months. And then what happens is the majority of production in the state will the extraction tax will drop significantly. That will go from, for a number of the wells, the extraction tax will be eliminated for 24 months if they're newly drilled. The first 24 months of production, and then it goes up to 9%. So that's a huge. What we've said is that right now our effective tax rate is about 11%. So it's very high. It is high. Our top rate is 11.5, but our average rate is about 11%. So most wells are paying that top rate. The effective rate would go down to about 6%, 6.5% if the triggers were to trigger on. And, of course, that happens if we go to that mid-50s range for 5 months. And it doesn't trigger off until we get above that trigger for 5 months. So it's a long-term incentive. So that's a huge revenue swing.
I know a lot of people that's kryptonite to them. They don't even want to talk about it. I honestly think that's a part of our tax code we ought to look at. I feel like that's a little scary that's in there. There's maybe something we could do to smooth out some of that uncertainty. Jay Thomas wants me to tell you that if the legislature doesn't address the income tax, he's pushing an initiated measure to eliminate the income tax. That's what he's saying.
Okay, well, we've had that before, and that's perfectly up to the voters, and if that's the case. But I do want to say that I do think I would put money on the fact that the legislature is going to pass some sort of relief, additional relief. Maybe not elimination, but I would guess that there would be